and we are good to go. So thank you all again for coming in today. Today we're going to talk about research design, that hopefully these ideas and how we, the demonstration of us trying to better align the research design to the research question can help your future project. And again, like throughout the whole talks, if you have any question, feel free to just pause us and then to ask your question. We would love to answer any of your questions, wonders, or at the end we also will have some Q&A time, so you could also ask your question, save it until later. Okay, so I'm Pei Rong, and Zhang Cheng's here too. Hi, Zhang Cheng. Oh, you mute yourself, but I guess that's fine.
Hi, nice to see everyone here.
Yes. Okay, so that's good started. So we will start with a little bit of the recap because we have been doing 2 workshops, which we hope this series of Tiny Method workshop could actually demonstrate a series of the steps that you would typically encounter throughout the research project. So in the first 2 workshops, we basically have introduced how to figure out or explore your research interest. And then the last workshop helps people to kind of find out a practical way to narrow down and generate a research question. So we are going to do a recap later. And then later on, we will do a very broad introduction of what research design means. And later we'll provide some concrete example. And so here's a really quick recap. Zhang Cheng, would you mind to go back? Yes, thank you. And so here we want to remind you of, like, in general, in the early stage of doing a research is to explore your research area or interest. And this is for graduate students, it's usually being done through course-taking or immersing in a field that includes your major. And so that's one of the a couple of ways. And then after you probably have an idea of the area that you want to dive into, the next step is to narrow down your research topic and later maybe general research question. So these are usually done by literature review, which I know a lot of graduate students really hate it, but it's actually really beneficial. And in the future, you will definitely engage in taking some minor courses. So through exploring some of your minors, you'll be able to further narrow it down. And of course, if you have colleagues or mentors, and if you are joining other collaborative research project, these are also beneficial for you to further narrow down your research topic. So next slide, thank you. So here we also provide a link of our previous 2 Tiny Method workshop, because I'm not going through too many details, but we did provide a concrete or some practical steps for you to generate or narrow down your research question, and also some resources. So you are also welcome to write us emails or make an appointment with us to help you with the process. Okay, next slide. So what does research design mean? That is our topic today. Next slide. So one of the scholars, he defined research design as to pinpoint of what you're going to measure. By measure, it's more quantitative approach, but in qualitatively, we means like you want to explore and what are the research approach that would be the best fit for your topic. So it actually includes developing a good design that could match your research goals to appropriate methods for addressing those goals. So basically it includes what type of data to collect, who to collect the data from, where to collect the data, and how to collect the data. So basically it's a circle that will go throughout the research process. because like the data, the research instruments you develop will influence the data, what kind of data, or you could collect, and of course it will further influence like what data will be collected, and then accordingly you will also think of like what kind of approach you could use to analyze those data. So basically you want to make sure the whole process is coherent throughout, and so we definitely encourage you to think through the methodological consideration beforehand and throughout the research process. So next slide, thank you. And so interestingly, I think some of the graduate students were not made aware of this, but there is a fixed design and flexible design. So typically what we learn from the textbook, it's okay, doing research is linear, that once you plan ahead, things are done, like you couldn't change it. But actually in reality, especially in most of the dissertation, the things or in reality, the research question are usually refined, and you are also adjusting your research design or activity throughout. So the fixed design basically means, and also again, it relates to your methodological consideration, but also your major, that these designs are used to quote unquote test the question. So the common ways are, for example, experimental design, but there are also flexible design. Again, like what I said, if you are conducting a more ethnography project, then it is likely you will not know what it looks like until you get into the field. So you may likely to adjust your research question or the research activity throughout the process. So again, we want to emphasize that it is totally fine in either in your dissertation, independent project, or in your future research project that you are adjusting things and refining things, because it's nature. So don't feel guilty about it, or don't feel like, no, I couldn't change things. It's totally okay, and just make sure you have communicate well with your advisor, mentor, or with your colleagues. So next slide, thank you. And so here we're going to provide some of the examples of the research design based on the literature. So this is from Patricia Levy. Her definition, she actually considered research design is a group of specific methods or tools that we use to collect or generate data. So here is a more qualitative, here are some more qualitative approaches. And later Junction will introduce some quantitative approaches. And after this, we will demonstrate by ourselves like how to generate some of the tools and research design that could answer a specific research question. So some of the examples of the qualitative approaches, including, for example, if you are adopting experimental design, then you will definitely try to reach out to your participant in a more randomized way, or you could engage in quasi design or single subject design, so on and so forth. And if you are conducting a research design, consider that as your research design genre, that you will definitely have questionnaires. And if you're thinking about interview, there are multiple ways of interview, like structures, semi-structures, or you might have some focus group. And if you have field research, then you may probably engage in participant observation, or right now, currently, a lot of people working on digital spaces, so maybe digital or visual ethnography. Other approaches that is not obtrusive, which is more commonly being used in social science, such as the content analysis or document analysis, basically means that you don't need to really work with people, that you just work on the documents or the archives things. And also case study, which a lot of people has termed their research as case study. In the future, we could possibly talk about what it really means, but that it could be one of the research design. And self-data, such as autoethnography, basically researchers position themselves as the center of the data or the research and try to reflect on their relationship with others, with the world, with their participants, so on and so forth. And of course, there are also mixed methods, where later the example we demonstrated could be a mixed method study. Or there are literacy practice. I think these are more contemporary, where our researcher try to form or write or conduct their research in a more, for example, fiction-based research or poetic inquiry, and or performative or visual art practice, where the visualization forms of data are included into their as part of the data, and also as their representation, such as collage, performance, theater, and also community-based research that engage with the action research or the participatory action research. So these are just one of the few examples of qualitative approach. Kind of gives you a idea of some of them may look more like a predefined, like quote unquote fixed approach. So for example, the experimental design, but some of them, especially for example, community-based design or the performative approach, are more fixed and more flexible. So next slide, and your turn.
Right. So the previous table just gave you an overview of so many different methods by category. But remember, those categories are not necessarily have a very clear boundary to distinguish between one from the other. And very often you're going to probably involving more than one practice in your own study. So here I'm just introduce some of the maybe kind of similar or popular quantitative approach. So mainly quantitative approach is you're going to deal with numerical data. And this data can be collected by yourself or some published third-party data, but the main difference from the qualitative part is we're going to work with numbers rather than some text. Then in this way, very often we will use stats methods to answer your research question. But which methods to use depends on the nature of your research question as well as the nature of your data. So methods, we have tons of methods, but those methods has their own limits and advantages. We need to select the most efficient way to answer our question. So you have to propose a very specific and clear question. And also you have to know your data well so that you can choose the most appropriate method. Well, either between qualitative and quantitative, and although within quantitative, but different methods. So, and also if you're from, for example, public health or any very specific funded project, you may want to conduct an experimental design, where you want to investigate a very specific question. Then in that way, different from kind of general survey collection, survey study, or using a third-party data study, a more stringent procedure and solid rationale is required for experimental design, because for experimental design, normally it really costs much higher than survey studies or studies rely on third-party data. And there are some very commonly used statistical methods. Here, just a very brief summary. Hi, Aris. A very brief summary. Of course, this table is not going to cover all the stats methods. There's tons a lot there. But all I'm listed here may be kind of more popular and common in the social science study. For example, the first column lists some of the research questions, and second column give you possible optional statistical tests or modeling methods to choose from. And the last column lists some of the considerations when you use these methods to answer your research question. You may be familiar with one or more of these methods, but as you, well, to your own knowledge of one specific modeling method, you should know what are the appropriate research questions to be answered and what are the modeling assumptions to be met. So this is a whole procedure of deciding what methods to use and then conducting the whole analysis, and then go back to provide solid justification and the validity evidence for the whole study. Okay, then following on, me and Perron, we are going to demonstrate both qualitative and quantitative study design based on a same set of research questions. In other words, we are going to use our own so-called methodological approach to answer the same question. And you can see like how different methodological approach will consider the same question, but in very different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we also encourage throughout the process, you also brainstorm that if it were you, how would you try to, or what kind of a research activity you will carry out to answer these questions. So let me first read these questions, and then I could talk a little bit about like how researcher can generally achieve or arrive at forming these questions. So first of all, I would say I'm interested in knowing what are the challenges that have been experienced by the international undergraduate student in this institution. So when forming question, one way is you could consider for example, I asked in the United States, that would definitely make it a much larger project. So if you have funding, you could definitely ask across the United States. But if this is just your independent project or your dissertation project, we would recommend you to consider the feasibility, which means it would cover your participant groups. So that in that way, I'm asking, it's in this institution. And also we try to avoid just asking or referring to a specific, for example, I say in IU, because that would make the institution identical. The second question, also following the first one, is what other support systems or resources that international undergraduate students seek help from them when they facing these challenges. So people could possibly achieve these questions in a way, for example, at first personally, I'm an international student, so I cares about international student. And so I want to first understand their challenges. That's my personal motivation. And, but also, for example, if my major or if I'm engaging in mental health or the consulting major, then I would also want to care about like the support system when the international student, when they face these challenges, or even if I were in the higher ed education major, then this support system is also very important for me to provide for the policymaker in the future, like to better refine the institutional policy, right? And so that is one of the way to kind of narrow down the research question from just general caring about international undergraduate student to specifically which aspect I want to dive into. And also, of course, I also want to read literature review to achieve these narrowing, process. And the third question is in which institutional level that the support system resources could resolve international undergraduate students' challenge more effectively. So maybe by writing these questions, I have been doing some of the study. For example, I've read a couple of articles or have done a research literature review of what are the support systems that generally has been identified for international students. But specifically, I want to explore in reality, quote unquote, or in the current era, like right now or post-COVID era, like whether or not these institutional level or supports still work and how effective they are. So that could help me to narrow down and generate this research question. And again, that also demonstrate how this process being made. So here, the next slide, I'm providing some of the examples of specifically qualitative research design that could help to answer each of these questions. And this is actually one of the table which some of the faculty call a smart table, but I generally just call it a table I really like to use when you communicate with your advisor and mentor in a way that it lists out your research question and you list out your research design or the activity you want to carry out. And also it could also actually in the last column, instead of like the tools needed or data collected, of course, you could also write the tools and data, but also you could also write the how these research activities or tools could answer your research question, in which way. And or if you are at the later stage of your study, you are doing analysis, you could also list out the analytical approach that you use to analyze these data and how they answer your research question. So in general, I find these kind of data, well, not data, but table kind of beneficial in a way to kind of list out everything and to do a more efficient communication with your advisor and mentors. So let's start with the first question, where I'm interested in about the challenges that has been experienced by international students. And so to do that, I will consider I have to do interview to really understand or know their experience. Or it could be a focus group interview if I have more participants. So if I'm considering to do in-depth interview, which for each participant, I want to do like 2 hours interview or 1 hour before multiple time, then if I'm doing this study by myself, I may just say I would just do about 10 students. That's fine too. But if you are thinking about, okay, I'm going to do like 30, we're working with 30 participants, then maybe a focus group could be another good ways for you to kind of explore the collective stories. Alternatively, you could also think about survey, but qualitatively, I would suggest to have multiple open-ended questions, not just one. Because some of the people, when they say, oh, I'm doing a mixed method, but what they do is they just have only one open-ended question at the end and say, what's your experience? And sometimes the participant may not generate as rich as data when you try to foster or facilitate by multiple open-ended questions. So that's my suggestion here. And so again, how these tools can answer these research questions is this interview protocol would target participants' challenge. So for example, I would start with, could you recall the time when you first arrived here in this institution and what was your first week looks like? Or even you could invite them to recall the first day, the typical first day, right? And then following that, you could ask, could you recall any difficult times or difficulties or the challenge you faced during your first week? So kind of moving from a general, and then you try to narrow it down. If you're interested in the interview skills, feel free to reach out for consulting or resources. I could send you some of the articles. And so the second question, we also want to ask, what are the support systems when they face these challenges? So again, to understand their experience here, I'm thinking about focus group interview. Basically, I'm adapting these throughout the whole 3 question, because considering the feasibility, I don't want to adapt over 5 research activity in a single research design or in a single project. That it's better probably just make it coherent, maybe just adapt interview or a focus group throughout. So try to make it simple. Don't feel like the more is better. Anyway, so again, for the second research question, I would say, for example, I would target the support system. So the approach I would do is to follow up by the first question I asked earlier about their challenges. And I would say, so earlier you mentioned these challenges you have faced. So when you encounter this, who or what kind of resources did you go to that seeking for help, if any? And if they answer no, I didn't find any resources, or I don't know any of the resources, then you could also following that to ask about the reason behind that. And then in which institutional level that the support system better support them. Again, with the interview protocol, we could focus on, earlier you have mentioned these and that support system. So for example, they mentioned I talked with my advisor or mentor, undergraduate student, they have mentors, or I go to CAPS, the consulting service, or I go to the writing tutorial service. And so here you could do a summary. Earlier you mentioned these and that. So which one do you think that helped you the most effectively? And could you elaborate a little bit more on that? And so you want to make sure you will get the things you want to quote unquote measure or you want to explore. Like for me, I want to explore in the institutional level, but qualitatively, I also want to know more about what are the reasons behind their thinking when they say, I go to CAPS and I think that's the most effective and helpful for me. Then you want to know why, instead of just saying, okay, CAPS, consulting server, that's the thing you use the most or something. So that's the qualitative design. Basically try to explore more of the phenomena and the reasons and the thoughts behind just getting the simple answer. So basically we want to explore more. That's a basic, like the quick summary here. So yeah.
Okay, so Perron just covered qualitative approach to answer the three research questions. So I will continue with quantitative approach as an example. So recall the three questions, asking about challenges, support system, and which institutional level will be most effective. So assuming when you have this question in your mind, you should have some knowledge about it from either your literature review or your just research interest. So you should have a knowledge like, what does it mean by challenge or support system or anything like that? You should have a well-defined, definition of those concepts. And then you go collect data. You can collect the data by survey or by published data where you do have access to such concepts that are similarly defined with your own definition. So then you are going to have a kind of your own framework of how data should be suitable for your question. And here we mentioned this when we introduced the question to make your research question more specific helps you when you collect the data, because if your questions are too general and broad, it gives you so much work in data collection. So for example, if we say narrow down to the so-called end institution as IU, then you're going to either collect data from IU undergrad international students or just go to interval case study with them, right? Then will be when you collect data before you send out your survey, you should first have an idea how many variables you should include in your final data. What are the measures of those question or so-called variables, and how you're going to design each of the questions. If you're going to send out a survey, how you're going to design each of the question statements so that you can collect the exact information you need, right? So here are, I listed some of the major, some of the main measures and maybe some background information. And you can see, oh. So for example, we have some very key components across our research question will be challenges, support system and resources, and effectiveness, right? So for example, if you have identified 3 types of challenges, well, here I'm just making up this number because there can be 30 rather than 3, right? But you have to determine the number or the so-called the different types of challenges, because when you speak to people, you can either make a pool of challenge and let them choose, let them select one or more, or you can just simply ask them and let them tell you what are the challenges. The difference is when you have a list for them to select, you kind of control the pool of your answers. And the other way is like you will collect a ton of answers, but you have to code those answers on yourself to, some of the challenges may be exactly the same, but expressed in different ways. You have to identify those so-called common responses. Then, but here I'm just raised as an example. If we have 3 types of challenges named as C1, C2, and C3, and then we ask our participants to respond it as, yes, I had faced those challenges, or no, I hadn't. These are the type of data we're going to collect for challenges. And it's kind of similar way to collect data for the support system or resources. For example, if we identify 4 types of support system or resources, and we again ask our participant to respond it with yes or no, indicating whether they will seek help from those support system or resources. And we also need to define what do we mean by effectiveness. Like, what do you mean by effective? Is it like solve your problem or just give you some, mental support? Or as a long-term or short-term, effectiveness is a very abstract concept. You need to have a very specific definition so that you can create a measure for that. So simply, for example, I'm just saying very, very often we're going to use a Likert scale, ask people for agreement of whether it's least or most effective, right? But before you ask such type of question, you first need to let your respondent know what do you mean by effective, so that they can give you the most accurate answer. And you also will, you can also you can also consider, well, because for example, we identify 4 types of support system or resource. Do you want to have your effective measure individually for each of the 4 support systems, or you want to ask an overall measure of all the response, all the support system or resources? That will be different because it will determine how wide your data is. Because you're either ending up with 4 measures of your effectiveness for each support system, or you're ending up with 1 measure for all of the systems, right? But if you choose to measure effectiveness for each of the support system your respondent has identified, but by the end of the day, you still need to create a summative measure. But the summative measure actually is based on their responses to each of the support system, rather than a very ambiguous or the very general response as overall. And then again, we also consider about institution level, and that will be a very obvious categorical variable, kind of like demographics, but it's institution level demographics rather than individual level demographics. But of course, in your data, you can have individual level demographics, including your respondents, gender, race, age, which country they come from. This all depending on how much information you need and you want to collect with your participants. So based on the previous examples, you may end up with a data frame like this. So here, if you can read it, we have student ID from depending on how many respondents you have has responded your survey. And we have 3 measures of C1 to C3 as challenges, and each of them will respond it as yes or no. And then we have 4 measures of challenges. They will also respond it as yes or no. And here I demonstrate if we're going to measure effectiveness for each of the support system each of the students have identified. For example, student 1 have identified using support system 2 and 4. Then this student will also rate the effectiveness of support system 2 and 4. I'm coded here as ES2 and ES4 respectively. But also I will have an overall, like a kind of composed score of the effectiveness. Here I am taking an average score. So I'm averaging, for example, for student 1, I'm averaging between 3 and 5. That will be ending up with a score 4. And here is the institution level indicator. But here I'm just adding random number of, depending on how many institution level you have identified. Before I'm saying I identify 3 institution level coded as 1, 2, 3, representing each. Well, you can define what 1, 2, 3 represents of the institution level. It can be, I don't know, department or school or the overall university, depending on your own definition, but you will know what are the labeling to these numbers. So your data probably ending up with a data like this, but your data can look different depending on how you're going to define relevant variables and the relevant scales. There are so many different decisions you can make depending on what we talk about here, right? Okay, so you have your data, and then you know your data well, because in your data, you will know what are the measures of each of the variables, how many variables involved. And then with the data and your research question, you're going to decide which are the stats methods we can use. So for example, all the questions, if you still remember all the questions are descriptive. Why? Because all the questions start with a what. So this is very common, particularly in quantitative study, in qualitative study, because we want to have our participant to elaborate their feeling about all the topics you're concerned with. So it's slightly different in quantitative study, because in quant, the question is more specific and narrowly defined. We normally ask a yes or no question, maybe followed with a how question. But by asking a question with what, then we have to first define the what, right? So this is slightly different. So because all the questions are descriptive, firstly, what you definitely want to consider is to present relevant descriptive summaries. Then depending on the scale of your variables, you're going to choose different ways to present your descriptive summaries. Because for example, for the challenges and support system, you want to maybe to record some of the frequencies, which are the mostly identified type of challenges and support systems, right? And for the effective measures, because we have choose kind of a Likert scale measure in our example data, then you want to report the either individual score and overall score for the sample. And also you can have a group summary with respect to the institution level, because we also care about this in our third question too. And additionally, in the third question, we also involve some type of comparison. We ask which institution level can provide the most effectiveness in terms of the support system. Now, obviously, you want to ranking the effectiveness score across all the institution levels, right? But that will be a simply descriptive statistic scope. Well, you can also, if you have a representative sample that's large enough, and your data, the distribution of your data meets some relevant assumptions, you can also consider perform an ANOVA test to see, for example, we have identified 3 institution levels, and we do see some difference across the 3 levels. But statistically, are those differences significant? Because always in stats, we care about, is there a significant difference, right? A significant effect or anything like that. Then you can consider do an ANOVA test. But then before doing that, you want to based on the purpose of your study, you want to make some justifications to your decision. First is, does it necessary? Is your study really want to identify based on the significance level to identify the so-called most effectiveness, the level that demonstrates the most effectiveness? And also, does your data really allows you to conduct an ANOVA study? Because there is a list of relevant assumptions needs to be met for ANOVA analysis. So you want to go back to check your data, make sure every assumption can be met based on your data. For example, if you only collect data from 15 students, then a sample size can be a concern, right? And also, if at the beginning of your study you have decided, yes, I definitely need to involve an ANOVA study in the latter step in my to answer my research question, then I will decide how should I create the measure of my effectiveness variable. Do I want to measure it from 1 to 5 or maybe 1 to 50? Well, that's a very specific thing you want to think about before you really have randomly develop a survey and distribute. And then when you have your data in your hand, it doesn't really help me. So better to think about this before, earlier rather than late. So that, and also some of the considerations using quantitative study, because when we want to make any conclusion statements based on numbers, we should be very careful, because the descriptive statistical results is only depending on the current sample. If you only collect sample from 15 IU students, anything you can speak about from a descriptive table are relevant to these 15 IU students, no more, right? And if you have a large enough sample allows you to do a hypothesis testing, and you do have a significant results, meaning you can have some generalizable inference based on the sample data. But still, you need to be very careful. Is the data from independently from a random sampling procedure? Are there any sampling bias or measurement errors that confines how large the scope you can generalize the current conclusion to a larger population? Okay, yeah, so that's all the kind of for demonstration purpose use the 3 research questions to think how we can approach from a quantitative side. Any questions? We are right now open with a Q&A. No?
Hi guys.
Yeah.
Hello.
My name is Zhao Yizhang, and I'm the 2nd year PhD student in literacy, culture, and language education. Mm-hmm. And I have a question about qualitative research. Last semester, I chose a class in quantitative field named how to design a survey or questionnaire, because I'm thinking that I want to design a survey in my future research. Mm-hmm. But my question is, does the survey or questionnaire can be regarded as a qualitative research? Mm-hmm. Because when I took that quantitative class, I feel very hard for me, so I dropped. But But I also want to do the questionnaire. So
Mhm.
yeah, do I need to continue to take that course? And if I want to design a questionnaire?
So my answer to that would be if you're collecting nominal data, which will be quantitative approach, like Zhang Chong demonstrated earlier. Basically, you have to strictly define the terms, and you have predefined the terms, and you are only giving them options. For example, you're giving them Likert scale scores, yes, no. So these are more quantitative approach. Well, for qualitatively, you could also use questionnaire or survey, but in the way that earlier when I said ask a couple of questions such as in your past few years or in your first year, what are the challenges you have faced there? So instead of like using interview, you could actually also ask these questions in a survey. So they will basically fill out a survey by typing or sharing their experience there through text. So the differences between, even though you're all using questionnaire or survey, the differences is whether or not you are only collecting nominal data and you are going to run and analyze your data in a nominal way, like you are reporting based on, numbers. Or if you're looking into the context and look into the text or the answer or the narrative, with survey, there's no narrative, but looking into the text and tell the story. So that's the differences that I would say.
Oh, okay, I see. Thank you. Because I don't want to use mixed method. I only want to focus on qualitative. So, oh yeah, I know
Yeah.
how to design a qualitative questionnaire. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I could also add on like the two approaches we designed earlier. Actually, these could also form a mixed method question. So one possible way, for example, if like Zhang Cheng say we want to run ANOVA, which requires a significant amount of participants to fill out the survey. But for interview, nobody can really interview like 300 people, right? So one of the way is you could put both nominal questions, like the question that Zhang Chong designed earlier, yes, no, or a Likert scale, plus a couple of open-ended questions. So not really only focus on qualitatively, but also at the end of the survey, you could also ask or invite them to share their willingness if they want to receive a follow-up interview. So by that way, you are narrowing your interview pool down. So you're not interviewing all these 300 respondents. You may probably 1/3 or 1/4 of them say, yes, I want to receive a follow-up interview. Then so maybe you're ended up only interviewing 50 or even less than that of the people. So now you got both kind of data. So this is one of the approach to brainstorm how to make it a mixed method. But of course, it's not necessary that you have to make it this way. Just it's all based on your research question.
Yeah, I want to add that up too. I mean, because regardless of whether you want to use survey or questionnaire or any, you name it differently, but I mean, to me, it's the same thing, like survey or questionnaire or whatever, a measurement or instrument. But the key point is what type of data you're collecting. I mean, if you're collecting qualitative data, then you're going to use qualitative method to analyze your data. Or if you're collecting quantitative data, meaning numbers, right? Because yes or no, well, it's like it is words, but you can simply code them as 0 and 1. So everything you can code it into numbers based on very strict distribution, then you can treat it as quantitative data. But there are some other data we just cannot transform into quantitative data. For example, people describing their experience or their stories, their whatever feelings you want to keep the richness of the information, then we cannot use number to represent, to abstract those information. Then for those data, you definitely need to use qualitative method to analyze those, meaning either use a survey or questionnaire or not. doesn't really determine you're going to use qualitative or quantitative way. The characteristic of your data is the key component you wanna think. Well, you can use survey or questionnaire to collect qualitative data. Just ask, rich type of answer questions. Oh, describe every like whatever this and that for me, rather than give them list to choose from, because you kind of narrow down the scope rather than let them to tell you a more rich story. Okay. Any other questions? We're all good.
So before we close up, we have a really quick announcement that this will be our last tiny method workshop for this semester, but we will continue doing that. And as I said at the beginning, our goal is to try to create a series of workshop that covers from the beginning to the end. So we've already been covering how to identify the research focus, create research question, and now we are doing the research design. So we will resume the resume the workshop by introducing some of the popular research activity, like earlier we say there are interview, qualitative interview, focus group, participant observation. These are very popular. So we will dive deep into some of these techniques and some of the strategies. And later we will also talk about the analytical process and also the writing up process.
Yeah, we will have our workshop, our tiny method workshop resume in the spring semester, and we will distribute information before. So welcome to join back. And also, if you need any assistance on methodological assistance on your own study, feel free to make an appointment with us.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for attending our workshop today. Everyone, you have a great evening.
Yep. I'll see you next semester in the tiny method workshop.
Yeah.
Bye.